My name is Kurczynski. I'm a professor in history of art and architecture, and I teach modern and contemporary art history.
What first drew you to art history, and how did modern and contemporary art become your passion?
I think they were always my passion in the sense that my mom and really both my parents took me to art museums growing up. I was always drawn to modern and contemporary art because they're more, I think of them as more challenging and they demand more from the viewer in terms of interpretation. There's much more variety of methods and subject matter than in earlier art. And as somebody who did art myself when I was younger, I was always drawn to kind of contemporary art. It's always throwing something new at you. So I appreciate
Mhm.
that. The excitement of it, the unpredictability of it, and the challenge.
Your research covers the intersection of art, politics, and activism. How do you see
Mhm.
contemporary artists continuing that legacy?
The artists that I teach tend to be the more politically engaged artists, and I'm fascinated by those who cross over into activism at different points in their life, sometimes through art, like the case of the Guerrilla Girls group, which I just taught in my contemporary art class.
Mhm.
But also others like Nicole Eisenman, an artist we showed at the UMCA a few years ago, who gets involved in activist projects sometimes, but her work or their work is not necessarily explicit in its political engagement, but yet I think it draws us into readings that are about the liberation of queer perspectives and other issues that are very political in our society. So I'm really drawn to the way art moves between different modes of engagement in relationship to politics. It can either be very contemplative and a way for you to step out of the immediacy of politics and think about it from a deeper point of view, or it can be more immediate, just depending on the material and the place that you're seeing it, really.
How do you think feminist art has changed over time, and what role does it play in today's conversations about gender and representation?
That's a really good question, and it's the subject I've been wrestling with in a current book project I'm writing on feminist contemporary art practices. What I've come to realize is that you have to break down in what way you're a feminist in terms of claiming they're taking a feminist perspective and recognize that to be a feminist has historically been an exclusive position. It's been associated with what scholars call white feminism. So recognizing intersectionality in short. I mean, I was always a feminist in my life. I was raised by a single mother who was a doctor, a really great role model for an independent woman who raised my brother and me. I always saw that as a key part of my identity, particularly when I was a young woman. It wasn't until much more recently, as I've gotten older and, seen all the changes in our society over the past 40 years, from identity politics in the 90s to Black Lives Matter today. And I realized that whiteness is such a huge part of my identity and that I can't, all of gender is linked directly to the other social identity categories that shape it. So there's nothing that unites all women in the world other than the very banal things like birth and death. But there are, the ways that white women share certain patterns of subjectivity and identification versus Black women. And the fact that I'm white puts me in a privileged position in relationship to other feminists, feminists of color, for example. The fact that I'm American gives me privilege. The fact that I'm heterosexual and upper middle class in my class background, all these other categories represent privilege. So it's interesting that I always identified with feminism because it was, as a woman, I felt like it was the one category where I understood oppression and social vulnerability. But yet now I see it in much more complex lens. And I have to speak, when I'm speaking to a group of students, my students are all mixed race, class, and ability status and everything else. And so I have to recognize that for many students, I'm speaking from a place of privilege as a white person who is a feminist. So I try to problematize what feminism means. The other big thing that's changed is queer studies in the past 40 years. So again, starting in the 1990s, when the term queer was taken back by gay, lesbian, transsexual people, today we talk about trans studies as a separate thing, but overlapping with queer studies. These things have to be discussed in relationship to feminism. I'm writing a book in which all of the artists I'm speaking about are women or non-binary artists. But, one of the publishers that I met with said, "Oh, why don't you put women artists in the title?" And I hesitated because actually I find that 10 years ago, maybe that would have been okay for me, but today I find that a problem because a non-binary person is not a woman. So, feminism today still has that root in feminine experience, and I usually prefer the term feminine to female,
Mhm.
because it's really about cultural attitudes and patterns more than biology. Today, you have to talk about what is trans femininity and trans masculinity, and how trans masculinity is also feminist and or can overlap with feminism. So, and queer studies has completely reshaped what it means to be a feminist. So, I try to also take that into account in my work.
So you talked about inclusion and also what you keep in mind when you're talking to your students. Could you kind
Mhm.
of expand upon how you integrate diversity, equity, inclusion into your teaching of modern and contemporary art?
In every way that I can is the short
Mhm.
answer.
Yeah.
I think all of my teaching, all of my research, all of my writing, every interaction I have with people in the world, professionally or socially, I'm always thinking about these dynamics of identification in
Mhm.
social identity in particular, the dynamics of power and vulnerability. So in my teaching, the first step was to make sure I'm representing Black artists, Indigenous artists, artists of color, Latinx artists, in every class that I do. So when I got to UMass 10 years ago, there was a modern art class that I took over and started teaching, and it's mostly early 20th century art. And I made that a global modern class. So it's a gen ed and it's DG, diversity global. And we talk about not only European artists, but we talk about Indigenous American artists. We talk about artists in China and India, South Asia, in and look at the politics of comparing these different art histories around the globe. I also helped make the survey of Renaissance to modern art global, so it's also a diversity global. So diversifying what I teach. I also really benefited from the Tide program on campus, so I just want to give a shout out to that to
Yeah.
Kristen Helmer, and that was a really transformative faculty seminar that I did that really helped me in my teaching to implement processes of equity in the way that I teach. And, I do things like um, give students a little more time with deadlines, have flexible deadlines over the space of a few days so that they
Mhm.
can not stay up all night.
Yep, definitely.
I talk a lot about prioritizing wellness, recognizing that different kinds of students, first gen students, students of color, face extra issues and burdens in the classroom that can interfere with getting work done on time. I have open conversations about those factors and, kind of welcome student perspectives and try to respect them and create a respectful place in the classroom. So turning to team-based learning in the modern art class was another way of like having the students work together with each other and encouraging them to work in groups of diverse perspectives. So the students had to learn how to be professional and do an assignment with a group of students who are coming from different places and talking about the politics of that as we do it. So yeah, I mean, in every way, I'm always trying new pedagogical strategies to see what helps, help um, facilitate these dialogues. So I think of teaching as a dialogue. It's not just hearing my own expertise. It's also what does the student see that maybe I don't see because they're coming from a different perspective.
With your experience as a curator, what do you believe makes an exhibition successful in engaging diverse audiences?
The what makes an exhibition engaging for me is the power of the work, and that is, of course, subjective and hard to define. But I think the work has to be multidimensional in the way it talks to different audiences. Often it's work that has a really powerful physical impact, a sensory impact. Like I really value art that's colorful and vibrant and material. I'm a huge fan of like modern painting, like abstract expressionism for that reason. But I
Mhm.
also love contemporary drawing or sculpture or installation. I think we've had a show like the Leonardo Drew exhibition we had a couple years ago at the UMCA
Mhm.
was really, really powerful for audiences. And there was a notable excitement about that show on campus because the work was these giant sculptures that were abstract, but yet they were physically really engaging, and
Mhm.
they represented things like urban space and political issues that you could fairly easily access, what the different references were in the sculptures. And I think with Layla Ali's work, it does that. It's a little more challenging in the place that it puts you in
Mhm.
because of what she's doing, the complexity of what she's doing. I think she's encouraging us to sit with the discomfort of not knowing what kind of person we're looking at in her drawings.
Mhm.
But it's very colorful. Some of her black and white drawings are extremely detailed and patterned, and it draws you in to look closer. So that's a very different strategy. It's much more about the small scale object that draws you in instead of, the large scale sculpture. So, there's a range of different strategies artists use, but in every way, I feel like a great artwork has to have a hook that draws you in and then a
Mhm.
critical content underlying it that makes you think, right? And it makes you reevaluate attitudes you already had or rethink issues that you thought you understood, or maybe you learned something from it, but not in a didactic way that's sort of dry and heavy-handed. That's the kind of art that I really steer clear of, ones that are too, cerebral or too dry or too, dogmatic in their political perspectives.
So
Right.
you touched upon Layla Ali's exhibition, and you played a key role in bringing that to the UMCA. What
Mhm.
drew you to her work, and why do you feel it was so important to showcase it?
I followed her work since the 1990s, actually, and I have an image to show you, actually.
Yeah.
This is a book of her greenheads paintings that I first saw in the
Oh, that's
1990s. They're these
awesome.
little figures that all have a green head, and they're wearing these little costumes that sometimes look like exercise costumes, and sometimes they look like either religious or, in this case, the hats evoke the Ku Klux Klan. They look like weird, inexplicable interactions that they're having. Those are the work that made her famous. So they put her on the map in the late 90s when she started showing in New York City and around the world. And
Mhm.
since then, her drawings have become really fascinating to me as I turned to my own research on drawing. When I was teaching a grad seminar on drawing and contemporary art in 2000, I think it was 22, I realized she teaches at Williams and it's an hour and 15 minutes away. And so the
Mhm.
first thing I did was invite her to come speak to my class. We ended up inviting her for a big public talk on campus. And a lot of people got exposed to her work at that point. And
Mhm.
fortunately enough, she was already involved in planning a retrospective of her drawings. So it really worked out for the two of us to enter a dialogue, and
Mhm.
I was able to write a catalog essay about the show of her drawings and encounter a whole bunch of different later work that I wasn't as familiar with. Because the drawings retrospective really shows all the different phases of her career from the early 90s when she's in grad school to today. So
Mhm.
it really showcases a broad evolution of her ideas, but in works that are less widely exhibited. So it's been a lot of fun to get to know the work better.
So you mentioned you wrote a catalog about her work, and you also led a gallery talk. What was your experience like leading this talk, and were there any memorable questions or discussions from visitors?
I love leading gallery talks. First of all, I worked at the Museum of Modern Art for years when I was in grad school at NYU. I was fortunate enough to have this job. I consider it the most fun job at the art museum. When you're in the galleries talking to the public about what's on display, you don't have to be involved in the politics of the back door, board of trustees and the curators and all
Mhm.
that. So I really love engaging with the public and what unexpected things people see in the work. Because contemporary art, it really is always welcoming of diverse readings. There's never any one way to read a piece of contemporary art. If it's a great, the work that I find most compelling and most complex has the broadest range of readings. So I just love being in the gallery talking about Layla's work because it encourages you to read, the little narratives that are going on with a couple of figures interacting, there's
Mhm.
always different ways to read them.
Yes.
And you're never quite sure if what's going on is an image of violence, or maybe it's just silly and fun, or maybe it's just playful, maybe it's even erotic. There's one image in the show of a figure bending over and a smaller figure is poking at them, and it looks like they're poking on their chest, these kind of dots on their chest.
Mhm.
And the funniest thing someone said to me was someone who came on the tour said, "Oh, it's like, when your parent asks you to look at some spot on their back and tell them if it looks like cancer, and you're like, "Oh, okay," and it's very uncomfortable." And it
Yeah.
was it was great because I never would have thought of that
Oh,
reading.
me neither. I remember seeing that piece. Definitely didn't come to my mind.
Yeah, it was just completely wacky, but also completely valid. And there's no wrong reading of these pieces. I mean, they all make you, what they do is kind of put you in a position to observe yourself observing and observe your own process of interpretation because each reading is provisional. So there's no definitive answer, but you become very aware of what you see in the image. If you see it as an image of violence, you might ask yourself, "Oh, why did I just go there? Why did I suddenly see that as violent?" So you learn about yourself in the end.
Mhm. You helped launch a program called Making Art Yours with the University Museum of Contemporary Art. Can you tell me about the project and the impact it had?
Yeah, that project was a few years ago. I think it was right before the pandemic. It was facilitated by a campus climate grant after Chancellor Swamy had implemented the first campus climate surveys. And so people were reading about how different identity groups felt more or less welcomed on campus. And I felt like I wanted to do something to make the art museum space more accessible to students who felt like they didn't belong there, or students who didn't know about it or didn't take the time to go.
Mhm.
I feel like I'm the unofficial ambassador for the art museum because I do teach contemporary art. It's always what they show. And my favorite thing is to bring people into that space and just talk about the work. So
Mhm.
it continues to be, my inspiration as a professor. So we sent out an application. We asked people to explain a little bit about their cultural background and asked them if they'd ever been to a museum before and how, what that experience has been like. We ended up choosing a small group of people that we prioritize people of color and people who hadn't been to art museums or hadn't been in a long time to
Mhm.
try to introduce that space and welcome them into the space. So the project, I hired Sid Ferreira as a co-facilitator for these small group discussions in front of artworks in the space of the art museum. And that was because I wanted to have a person of color who was trained in social justice facilitating. And he's a big presence on this campus. He's done a lot of different work in that capacity. So he was a really great interlocutor with a group of maybe 10 students. We gave them a free dinner. We also gave them a stipend because the project was inspired by a project some artists did at RISD called Look at Art, Get Paid, where they
Mhm.
paid local community members to come to the art museum and be art critic for the day.
Oh,
So
that's
one
cool.
of the things that Making Art Yours involved was the students, before we said a single word about the art, we sent them around the museum with a piece of paper to take notes on what appealed to them and what didn't, and what made them feel welcome and what made them feel confused. So they were art critics for the evening.
Mhm.
And it sort of empowered visitors to feel like their opinions matter,
Yeah, definitely.
obviously. And then we had a long discussion in front of a single artwork for the rest of the evening, and those were really eye-opening because, we started out with basic questions. What are you looking at? Because art, it teaches you how to be a really good close observer and
Mhm.
how to use the very specific language in what you're describing. So we practiced those skills and then we slowly zoomed in on, how does it make you feel? How do you connect it to your life? How do you connect it to the broader society and politics? And through that process, we really got to know these students and we
Mhm.
realized that a lot of them were we got a lot of science majors actually that loved art but just didn't have time to go to the art museum or hadn't had a lot of experience with it in the past.
Mhm.
Um, So it was a really fun program. And I think the problem was it was an extra thing on top of my teaching. So
Mhm.
what I decided to do is make it a permanent service learning project in my contemporary art class. That's what we're doing this semester.
Oh,
So
awesome.
instead of inviting students on campus to come into the museum, we're going to high schools and one elementary school. And we're especially high schools in Springfield and Holyoke, but also Amherst.
Hmm.
So we're trying to get diverse students into the art museum. In some cases, like the students from Dean High School in Holyoke, there's no art program there because it's a technical high school.
Hmm.
So those students, it's a really special experience to come see the art museum. We give them a free lunch. We're working on this project where over 200 high school and a small group of elementary school kids will be coming through the art museum with my students.
What is the best piece of advice you've ever received about working in our art world?
Best thing people have told me about the art world is that it's not a single art world.
Hmm.
The art world, especially in the contemporary art world, there's more artists living today than ever before and participating in gallery spaces and biennials and nonprofit art spaces. There's more of everything than ever before. More money in the art world, but also more nonprofits and university spaces and those kind of things.
Hmm.
So I think it's the most important thing is to decide what art world you want to be a part of and not feel like you have to be, involved in the big spectacular commercial side of the world that tends to dominate the headlines. The headlines we see about contemporary art are always about money and what something's sold for and or what kind of crazy antics some artists did. But you
Hmm.
don't have to do the crazy antics to be a great artist. You can just be a quiet painter like
Yep.
Layla Ali. And in many ways, that work is more profound and speaks more to posterity than the former kind of artist. So it's just a matter of which art world matters to you. So,
Hmm.
I think my kids' art matters to me. My kids are artists.
Oh.
People who doodle on the side of a paper in a faculty meeting, that is art too. I try to break down those kind of boundaries. In my classes, we tend to talk about the artists that are the most well known that engage history, and that's because it's an art history class, and we want to talk about the ones who had the broadest impact on a society. But
Hmm.
I'm constantly kind of reflecting on the choices and talking to students about, what choices would you make? What artist spoke to you in this chapter and why? And maybe next time I might include more of those artists. So it's again back to the idea of dialogue, I guess.
If you could organize a dream exhibition bringing together any artists or themes, what would it focus on and why?
I love art that speaks to the most pressing social and political themes that are happening right now. I think that my book project relates to one of those themes, which is identity politics, the and social identity and how it shapes our relationship to images and representation. So my book project in a way for an art historian, that is their ideal exhibition. It's like that I would choose those artists. It's Shazia Sikandar and Chitra Ganesh and Layla Ali, Nicole
Hmm.
Eisenman. These are each chapters of my book, and they each have really valuable perspectives on power and vulnerability, on exclusion, histories of race and colonialism and representation, in relationship to social identity, gender, race, sexuality, ability status, and all the other things on the identity wheels
Hmm.
that we do in my classes. So I would love to see an exhibition with all those artists. Several of them have been showing or are showing at the UMCA in Layla Ali's case.
Hmm.
And there's other pressing issues that I would love to see a show about. And in fact, the grad students in the curatorial fellowship are about to open one. It's called Off Balance Art in the Age of Human Impact, and it's a show that deals with climate change and the idea of the Anthropocene, the idea that we're in this human-shaped geological era. So that is the other issue that I think is kind of the most pressing on my mind today.
Hmm.
I would love to do more with that idea and explore how artists have approached climate change and other um, environmental politics.
That was my last question. Is there anything else you'd like to add or talk about that we didn't get to?
I appreciate the questions. I appreciate any discussion of feminism. I There was a time when I started teaching 20 years ago when students didn't want to use the term and they called it the F word.
Oh,
And
wow.
thinking back to that time, it's really funny to me because today, no one's afraid of self-identifying as a feminist that I've heard. I mean, people may or may not identify that way, but
Mhm.
it's not a taboo anymore. I appreciate that it's become a topic again on people's minds because the issues are never going to go away.